The Israel Defense Forces responded today, quote, "Since the incident, the IDF has been examining and investigating the circumstance of the reporter's death rigorously and in depth. The interim investigation that was published revealed that it was not possible to determine the source of the shooting that hit and killed the reporter. The claim that the shooting is intentional is completely unfounded." Well, joining us now in the studio for more is Shaun Sacks. He is a senior researcher for NGO Monitor. Shaun, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, of course, the CNN report is raising a lot of questions about the incidents that took place in Jenin 2 weeks ago, but also questions are being raised here about the CNN report itself.
Correct. I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is there was a tragic shooting death of a journalist. And it's important that the truth does come out. But unfortunately, what we've seen here is CNN has turned to the NGO network, and particularly an NGO activist who has a history going back almost 20 years of working with anti-Israel NGOs, even going back to Jenin in 2002, where the same Mr. Cobb-Smith was responsible for an Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch report that came on the back of the libel of a Jenin massacre and hundreds, if not thousands, murdered by the IDF.
Right. I want to just clarify. Cobb-Smith was, I guess, this ballistic expert that claimed that because of the pattern of, I guess, instances where bullets may have skimmed this tree, the shooting was intentional, which seems like a huge leap of logic.
Well, it's very interesting because in 2002, Cobb-Smith was an expert who was hired to look into claims of a massacre. He didn't do a very authentic job then. In 2009, again, he was in Gaza, and there he was an artillery expert, claiming that, correctly, that he was an artillery officer in the British Armed Forces. But now suddenly he's a ballistics expert, and from afar he can claim to know what the intent of a shooter was, which is also a little bit bizarre. And when we look at his history, not only with that, with other NGOs as well. Al-Haq, for example, a Palestinian NGO that is very active in trying to have Israelis brought to the ICC, he wrote a field manual for them. So rather than being a real expert or an independent expert, we're seeing that CNN fell back on the trusted method of hiring NGO activists to berate and claim that Israel is guilty before any real evidence is found.
I want to pull in another comparison that groups like NGO Monitor also dealt with, and that was that New York Times report on the number of civilians supposedly killed in Gaza during the operation, where they relied on Palestinian sources, even on Hamas-related sources, only to find later that several of the people they cited as civilians had, in fact, even openly identified themselves as Hamas militants. And this is one of the issues with these type of investigations.
Right. We see that over and over again, going back over the last 15 years, where NGOs will cite one statistic, but the reality is far different. Mr. Cobb-Smith, again, has worked with many of these NGOs, including the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, which has a very interesting definition of a militant or a terrorist, and has quite openly referred to a number of Hamas and Islamic Jihad people who were killed in various operations against the Israelis. In their reports internationally, they call these same people innocent civilians.
Right. I do want to point to look at another, besides the whole claim about the fire pattern in the tree, some other evidence they suggest pointing to the Israeli side, which I think was actually pulled more from a group called Bellingcat, which does not have a particular attitude toward Israel as far as I'm concerned, but had to do with the audio recordings of the thing. Let's see if we could play that clip.
The gunfire you hear at the beginning of this clip is key. Eyewitness testimony and audio analysis show these are the shots that kill Abu Akleh. There is a crack and then a pop. The time between these two sounds reveals how far away the gunmen are. This indicates a distance of between 177 and 197 meters, according to forensic audio analyst Rob Mayer.
Now, that piece of evidence seems on firmer ground, but I think we should note here, the IDF has never said that they have any evidence directly that's showing that the fire may not have come from the Israeli side. It's just that without the bullet, they certainly can't confirm that. And again, they said this was an incident in which there was a crossfire going on with Palestinian terrorists that were firing at the same time.
Absolutely. I think 3 points need to be made here. The first is, It's inconclusive. There is a very real possibility that this journalist unfortunately was killed by the IDF. I don't think anybody would actually rule that out. The second is, even the audio says it relies on eyewitness testimony. Now, going back for 20 years, especially in Jenin, the eyewitness testimony has been very unreliable. In fact, the Jenin libel from 2002 was as a result of so-called eyewitness testimony. And the third point, and I think this is very important, coming back to the current journalist and the NGOs, is in a multitude of reports from various NGOs going back many years, there has never been an NGO report of a Palestinian killed in clashes between the IDF by Palestinian fire. Even the IDF has acknowledged a number of times IDF soldiers were killed in so-called blue-on-blue instances where the IDF...
what we call friendly fire. Certainly U.S. parlance.
Even the IDF has acknowledged there have been times where there's been crossfire and Palestinian civilians have been killed. No NGO for 20 years has ever acknowledged a Palestinian killed by a Palestinian in a crossfire with the IDF. That should immediately raise a number of red flags about trusting these so-called experts.
So I just want to ask you, Shaun, where do you think Israel has, there is an investigation going on. The U.S., there are certainly parts of the U.S. government that want to see some kind of independent investigation. Should Israel, for example, be going for how to handle this situation? Because we certainly have not heard the last of the circumstances beyond Abu Akleh's killing.
Well, I think the IDF definitely needs to conduct a very thorough investigation that should be open to various international elements. I think the saddest thing is that the Palestinians themselves don't want to be involved and instead have even said that they're taking this case to the ICC, which, if they're lucky, it will take years, maybe decades, before even the ICC even looks at this case. So the justice will not come in an international arena anytime soon. Here is an opportunity to actually find out who is responsible for the death and hopefully bring the perpetrators to justice, even if it was accidental. But the IDF has acknowledged they will run an investigation. There is absolutely no mechanism or even an intent on the Palestinian side to look into what really happened.
Right, and you don't certainly expect that whatever the results of the IDF investigation, it's going to be accepted either by the Palestinians or by certainly some of the other players that we've been discussing here.
Unfortunately, it won't, no.
All right, so certainly, like I said before, I don't think we have heard the last of the Shireen Abu Akleh case. In fact, I think we're going to be hearing quite a bit more of it in the months and even in the years to come. Shaun Sacks, senior researcher at NGO Monitor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On The Rundown.